Welcome. Good evening, everyone. All right, we seem to be getting a few people settled in. Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Perfect. We'll just give everyone a few more minutes to log in and get settled. Caleb, in the meantime, if I can just have you quickly test the microphone just to make sure that we get audio.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Perfect.
Sound good?
Fantastic. All right, so we seem to be having everyone kind of trickle in. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Hanna, and I'm the Events and Programs Manager at COPA, and on behalf of the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Aviation Insurance 101, a quick and friendly chat with Caleb Winterburn. So as many of you know, COPA's mission is to promote and protect general aviation and really promote our members' freedom to fly. We do this through different advocacy, education, events, and programs that all come together to help pilots navigate the regulatory, operational, and economic realities of flying in Canada. Today's session comes as part of that commitment, making sure that all of our members have the information and the support that they need to make informed decisions and operate their aircraft in safety and with confidence. Today's webinar focuses on aviation insurance and COPA's member-exclusive aviation insurance program, the Aviators Canada Insurance Program, or ACIP for short. Our partners at Covalen will walk us through how aviation insurance works, the different elements that people might need some extra guidance on, and maybe talk a little bit more about ACIP as a program, how it works, what makes it unique, and how different types of coverage are tailored specifically to the needs of COPA members. So we'll be covering topics including different types of coverage, hull coverage, liability, passenger liability, the importance of check rides, forced landing coverage, lots of other topics that Caleb will be walking us through. Our goal today is to give you a clear and practical understanding of aviation insurance, what matters the most, and where pilots often have questions, we try to really demystify aviation insurance as much as we can. Before we go ahead and get started, I'll just go through some very quick housekeeping notes. So the allotted time for this webinar is 1 hour. We will have approximately, we will hear from Caleb for about 45 minutes and leave the last 15 minutes for Q&A. All participant microphones are going to be muted during the webinar. If you do have any questions, we encourage you to submit those questions at any time using the Q&A or the chat function if you're joining us on Microsoft Teams, or if you are joining us on the live stream on YouTube, you can submit your questions in the chat. And we'll try our best to get as many of those questions answered as possible. With all of that said, I'd like to ask everyone to join me today in welcoming Caleb. Caleb Winterburn is the Vice President of Aviation Insurance at Covalen. Caleb has been a pilot for the past 14 years and has been working in insurance for over 15 years. Over all that time, he has supported many pilots and aircraft owners across Canada in navigating aviation insurance with confidence. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Caleb to introduce yourself and take us through today's webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah, for the introduction there. I really appreciate it. So I always like to quickly say along those lines. So as you mentioned, I've been doing aviation insurance for 15 plus years. I started when I was 18, so it's been a long journey. I've done well over 20,000 aircraft insurance policies. And over the years, I've obtained my commercial fixed wing license, my commercial helicopter license, and I have my float rating, and hopefully in the future be able to do my IFR and multi-engine rating. And a lot of the reasons why I did those things is because I wanted to better understand aviation, especially if I was selling aircraft insurance. And so it's really helped me over the years gain a better knowledge of this industry. So throughout this presentation, I always like to talk about, obviously, aviation insurance, but I like to give real life examples, as well as I like to break it down usually with these three things. The main thing we're going to be talking about, obviously, is the main types of coverages and check rides. And then we're going to go through commonly asked questions that I get each and every day when I'm doing aircraft insurance. And then lastly, we're going to go through the enhancement and coverages that are included in the Aviators Canada Insurance Program. So we're going to kick it off right now by going through those main three coverages that we talk about with pilots each and every day. So the first one is all risk flight and ground coverage. What that means is if you are to buy an aircraft, let's say it's a Cessna 172 and it's worth $100,000, and you obtain this type of coverage, this comprehensive coverage, and you have the aircraft in storage and a hangar collapses on it and it's destroyed, you'll have the $100,000. Or if you are taxiing the aircraft and you go and fly the aircraft and you have an accident, you will still have the $100,000 worth of coverage. That's why it's considered all risk flight and ground coverage, because it's fully comprehensive for your aircraft insurance. Now, people always think that this coverage is relatively expensive, but it actually, compared to car insurance and other types of insurance, is really not that bad, and you do get a lot of extra coverage. So the first one is that full coverage that most pilots buy. And one of the biggest benefits of that is you obtain salvage recovery for the aircraft if you were to have an accident. And we're going to dive into that a little bit later in the presentation. Now, the second coverage that people buy is they buy not in motion coverage. What this coverage is for is it allows you, if you're storing your aircraft for the winter and it was to get damaged, you would have coverage on your aircraft. But now the moment that you bring your aircraft out, it's a beautiful day, and you start the propeller, at that very point, there's no longer physical damage for your aircraft. So if you're taxiing and you hit a pothole, or you're flying and you have a forced landing and crash your aircraft, you no longer would have physical damage for your aircraft. But you would still, of course, have in-flight liability so that you can legally fly the aircraft and meet Transport Canada regulations. Now, this coverage, of course, is a little bit cheaper. But what people don't realize is the span from full coverage to not in motion coverage, and the cost is actually not that bad these days. So this is why we always recommend going with full coverage. Now, the third main coverage that people purchase is liability only coverage. They say, I have enough money, or I don't worry about it. In the event of an accident, if I crash, I'm going to pass away anyway. So they decide to buy liability only coverage. And on a side note, in most accidents, the pilot usually survives. So in that case, it doesn't really apply. But people want to try and save money, so they buy liability only so that they can meet Transport Canada's regulations and be able to fly the aircraft. But what they don't think about is that it doesn't have the salvage recovery costs. So if you do go crash an aircraft, you don't have the money with the coverage to be able to get a helicopter to go get the aircraft. So let's say in the event that you do maybe pass away, or an individual passes away in an accident, what I always suggest to them is to have a separate bank account or separate notes for their spouse or family, that they have the funds to be able to go get the aircraft, be able to have the adjuster's phone number, or all of these extra things for the rest of the family. And so maybe in some cases, it's okay to buy just liability only. But personally for myself, I want to buy full coverage for the aircraft insurance, because the owner, whoever I'm flying their machine, or if I was flying my own, I want to make sure, number one, that of course we get the money in the event of a loss, but I want to make sure that my family is looked after by having salvage recovery. So the three main coverages that we just discussed is the top one, full coverage. The second one, not in motion, when you have coverage when it's in storage, but the moment that you turn your propeller on, that you no longer have physical damage coverage for the aircraft. And the last one below that is liability only, so that you can legally fly your aircraft and meet Transport Canada's regulations. Now, one of the main questions I get almost every single day is, what liability coverage should I purchase for my aircraft? Or how much liability coverage should I purchase? And so as an aviation insurance broker, I have to always say, just to protect myself so I don't get sued, is the highest coverage that you can afford. But 10 years ago, roughly, the average bodily claim was around $500,000. So let's say you're flying your Cessna 172 and you have 3 passengers. That's $1.5 million that you would at least want to have, plus another $500,000 if you were to hit a building or hit something. So the majority of pilots in Canada have at least $2 million for their liability limit. So I recommend at least $2 million or higher if you're going to purchase it. So amongst those coverages that we just discussed, as well as the liability, the next question that I always get when we're doing a renewal application is, how much should I insure my aircraft? And what happens if I overinsure my aircraft and if I underinsure my aircraft? So first, to talk about what happens if you underinsure your aircraft. Let's say that you have a Cessna 172 and it's worth $100,000, which I know a lot of Cessna 172s nowadays are worth quite a bit more than that, especially with all the costs. But we'll give the example of $100,000, and an individual is thinking to themselves, I'm going to insure it for 20 grand, so at least I have salvage recovery, but I can save some money on it. So they insure their aircraft for $20,000, and one day, beautiful day, they're taxiing and they hit a pothole and they have a prop strike. At that point, that prop strike most likely is going to exceed that $20,000. So what the insurance company is going to do is they're going to cut you a check for $20,000 and then take your aircraft. So that's why we would never want to underinsure our aircraft. Now, on the other side, why you would not want to overinsure your aircraft, let's say you're thinking you have a Cessna 172 and you want to get a Cirrus, an older Cirrus, maybe 2006, 2007. So you insure your Cessna 172 for $300,000. And let's say the insurance company, they agree to it. Well, when they find out after you have an accident that your aircraft was only worth $100,000, what they're going to do is they're going to take as much time to try and fix that aircraft instead of writing that off. And what that means for you is you potentially can miss out on a whole flying season, the whole summer, spring, summer, and fall. So that's why we would want to insure the aircraft for what it's actually worth. But the question then we have to ask is, what is the aircraft worth and how can we determine that? Well, Blue Book values in Canada, the cost to have them is quite expensive. So what we always recommend is that an individual goes to Barnstormers, Controller.com, Trade a Plane, and compare the aircraft to what other aircraft are going on the market. That's a good start and a free option to look at. Now, you can do other things, which is more expensive, by getting an actual appraisal on the aircraft, or you can do something that's a little bit cheaper and just get a desktop appraisal for your aircraft. They usually cost between, for a piston machine, about $800 to $1,200. And if you think about it, you have a Cessna 172 and it's worth $100,000 and that's what you try to insure, and you get a desktop appraisal. You spend $1,000 and they find out that your aircraft is actually worth $120,000. And then you have an accident and you write it off. Well, that $1,000 that you spent actually saved you $19,000 more. So I always recommend reaching out to someone to potentially do a desktop appraisal for your aircraft. Now, one thing that I really love about aircraft insurance compared to doing home insurance and commercial insurance, and I have done them before and it's very tedious and a lot of work, is aircraft insurance has what we call a stated amount clause. So if you say that the aircraft insurance is worth, or the aircraft is worth $100,000, and the insurance company agrees to insure you for that $100,000, and you have an accident, they are just going to cut you a check for $100,000. They don't say it's a 1960 aircraft, depreciation over the last 50 years, and it's only worth 40, and here you go for 40, even though you were paying for 100. So that's why I really love doing aircraft insurance. It's straightforward, and the insurance company is more willing to just quickly cut you that check so that you can go buy your next aircraft and get back in the sky. So these are the main things I like to talk about first for the main coverages, how much to insure your hull value, the liability, etc. But the next thing I want to go on after this is to talk about the importance of check rides. See, people are always wondering, do I get a check ride? Will it save money on my insurance policy? But a lot of people are just thinking about the finance side of it. And no doubt with our rating and insurance companies rating, if you fly a lot in a year and you do a check ride, it can potentially save you money on your aircraft insurance. But getting a check ride is more important than just the finances that we save on there. It can actually mean our life. And I remember years ago, there was a guy that did not want to go for a check ride. And we fought with him to do this check ride. And finally, he did it. Well, a month later, we get a phone call. Guy says to me, he says, you know what? Thank you so much for making me do that check ride. I unfortunately just had a forced landing, but because I had done that check ride, we had went through the emergency procedures and practiced everything, and it helped save my life. So it's more than just trying to save money in insurance, but it's actually more for an individual's life and just being up to date with flying. And I always still remember, of course, as I mentioned, I've done both my licenses and stuff. I don't have the most amount of time, but I've been able to learn about obviously retract aircraft, tail aircraft, and get a sense over the years of how much hours an individual should get. And sometimes an insurance company says, no, you only need this. But then we look at the policy and we go back to them and say, maybe an individual should have this because we're pilots. So with regards to that, there was an example a couple of years ago in 2022 when a guy came to me and he was getting a retract aircraft. And I told him, I said, you need at least 5 hours on this. For every tail wheel and every retract, an individual should at least get 5 hours prior to flying solo. If not, I really do actually prefer 10. But this person ended up finding another broker that said they only just had to do a check ride. Well, unfortunately, in 4.4 hours, he had an accident and unfortunately passed away. And this could have been something that could have been prevented by just doing a little bit more training. And I remember about a year ago, I was doing a rust remover in Northern Alberta, and I was giving this example, and an individual came up to me afterwards, and they said to me, that pilot, I actually checked out that pilot, and he did not like you because you were trying to force him to do that 5 hours. But the thing is, as an aviation insurance broker, we've seen it over the years. And so we're just trying to help individuals with their training on there. But then that comes to the next point. Is it rigid that an individual has to always go with a flight instructor? When you look at aircraft policies in Canada and you get a quote back, most of them are always going to state subject to a checkout with a certified pilot or qualified flight instructor prior to flying solo, or they're going to give you 5 hours or 10 hours. So an individual is in the middle of Saskatchewan, they buy a tail aircraft, and they're trying to find a certified flight instructor to do the training for them. But what they don't understand is they can actually usually find a qualified commercial pilot, or maybe even a previous owner, even if they have their private pilot's license. And if we get their pilot information report, we can usually send it to the insurance company and they will actually approve that pilot to do the training for them. So it will normally say they will be subject to a checkout with a qualified flight instructor or that other pilot prior to flying solo. So it's not as rigid as what we think. And I really like to explain this to people that we can have other people check you out because there may be a 300-hour flight instructor that has no experience on that aircraft. Are they really qualified? Or is it better to find another pilot that's a commercial pilot that is qualified to check you out? So that's one thing that a lot of misconception that people think that it always has to be a flight instructor to do the training. Now, with regards to check rides for flight instructors, are they automatically covered on the aircraft when they're providing flight instruction for the named pilot? Well, in most cases, in the policies in Canada, a flight instructor is usually covered while they are providing flight instruction for a named pilot that's listed on the policy. But what we need to understand is that they actually need to be named on, or they need to be training a named pilot. And the named pilot actually has to be in the aircraft. So if you're saying, oh, I'm going to get my flight instructor, they're going to bring the aircraft over and then we're going to go for a flight. Well, that flight instructor for that flight over would not be covered. So they always has to be a training flight and the flight instructor has to be in the aircraft. The biggest thing that we're trying to reiterate to pilots through the aircraft insurance in Canada is just to stay humble for these check rides, the importance of looking after one another and staying up to date with the regulations. And then one thing we're going to talk about later on in this seminar is about forced landings, but that's something that's very, very important to understand that coverage. But now we've kind of concluded that first part about the main coverages and the importance of check rides. So now we're going to jump into the commonly asked questions that I get all the time, each and every day, and our team gets. One of them is, how can I add a pilot onto my policy? Well, if you want to add a pilot to fly your Cessna 172 or your Cherokee, you need to request from the broker to send you a pilot information report. So the broker sends the pilot information report to you. You fill it out and you send it back. Then we send it back to the insurance company for the approval. They send us back terms such as, this pilot is subject to 5 hours dual with a qualified flight instructor prior to flying solo. Then you have to agree to it, and then we do an updated document, whether it's a certificate of insurance or a binder. Once you have that document, then they can start the training. I see this quite often where they say they see they need to do 5 hours, so then they go 5 hours flying the aircraft, and then they come back to the broker saying, well, he did his 5 hours, now can you add him to the policy? But they actually need to be added to the policy before they start flying the aircraft. So that's one of the main questions I get. Another one is flying somebody else's aircraft. Over the years, I've flown probably 26, 27 different airplanes. And one of the things I've always talked to the aircraft owner is, in the event of an accident, I will personally cover the deductible. Unless it's a higher deductible, maybe we'll split it. And also, I always say I will cover the rate increase for the first year. So if you have other people flying your aircraft, that's something to discuss or put in a contract together. Who will cover the deductible? Because I've seen a lot of friendships break because this discussion between the pilots and the aircraft owner was never addressed. So that's just something to think about. Now, with regards to training, can a student pilot buy an aircraft and do their training on it? Do they always have to do the training at a flight school? Well, the interesting thing is, and gets talked about at all the airports, is you need to start on a Cessna 172, a Piper PA-28, do your training, and then you can go get your aircraft. But you can actually buy the aircraft that you want to do your training on. For example, I've had many times over the years, people buy a brand new Cirrus, and even now with the value that they are, which is extremely expensive, is it's $2 million, let's say, we're able to get an insurance policy for them. But one of the things I always do when I find out if somebody wants to buy like a Mooney, Comanche, or a Cirrus, I like to talk to them on the phone first. And I like to hear the attitude that they have and what they plan on doing for training. Because the thing is, if somebody has a humble attitude and they're willing to do the training, we want to be able to make it work for them, be able to get the aircraft that they want to actually buy and be able to train on it, whether it means increased premium, increased deductible, more hours in the training part of it. But usually in most cases, we have been able to make it work for an individual that is trying to buy a higher performance aircraft instead of just a 1970 Cessna 172. So that's one question I get. Another one, it's very interesting, is with regards to a bill of sale. So let's say you have somebody in Alberta and you have somebody in Ontario, and they say to the person, I'm selling my aircraft to this individual. They're going to fly the aircraft from Alberta over to Ontario, and then we're going to call up their broker and we're going to take off the insurance for them. Well, what happens if they've already signed the bill of sale and there's already been a transfer of funds? Well, at that moment, the coverage actually stops. So the coverage stops in Alberta, but then an individual is flying an aircraft across over to Ontario, and because there's no insurance, there's no liability coverage, so they're not following Transport Canada's regulations. And if there was an accident, there would be no coverage. So if there's a bill of sale signed and there's been a transfer of funds, at that point is when the insurance stops for an individual. So always pay attention when you're selling the aircraft, where the bill or when the bill of sale is signed. Now, a lot of people, they want to train with a freelance flight instructor or a flight instructor from another school. Well, they can do that. Sometimes the flight school wants to be added on the individual's policy for protection. That's something that can be added at no extra cost. And it can be something that can be done within a day or two. And they usually want to be named what we call as an additional insured. So if you need the flight school to be added on your policy, that's usually not an issue. Now, another question I get is, can I put my aircraft into owner maintenance category? And the answer is yes. Now, years ago, if an individual put in an owner maintenance category, the insurance premiums would go up. But at this point, it doesn't really affect the insurance premiums. We still want to notify the insurance company to make sure that they know what is going on. But the only thing is, I guess, if you put an owner maintenance category, besides being able to work on it yourself, it definitely does devalue the aircraft a little bit. But it should not be changing the insurance rates on the aircraft insurance. Now, another question is, can I insure an unregistered aircraft in Canada? Obviously, you need to follow Transport Canada regulations of importing the aircraft within a certain period of time. But some people do have a US address and they want to keep it unregistered and they have followed the regulations. With most markets, they don't want to do it. But with the Aviators Canada Insurance Program, it's not an issue for us to insure an unregistered aircraft in Canada. Now, I always like to talk about two interesting questions or things that I've learned over the years that I always like to share in these presentations. Did you know that if you buy a warbird, whether it's a Harvard or an Nangcheng, that you don't have to obtain an air operating certificate in order to be able to do paid rides for individuals? It was interesting, years ago, a guy called in and he was looking at buying a Nangcheng and he said to me, he says, it's very difficult. He says, I'm looking through Transport Canada regulations. I've heard about this. And he says, you must be able to speak Chinese to be able to find this. And I said to the guy, funny enough, 8 years ago, I started learning Mandarin. So I said, I do speak Chinese and I know the exact regulations. So I was able to help him out so that he was able to do buy a Nangcheng and be able to do paid rides in the aircraft. So I definitely recommend looking up that as something unique in there. And then the last one was about 10 years ago, I got a question from somebody and they asked me, I have a Vans RV3 that I'm buying, but I don't know how to be able to get checked out on the airplane. And so we were talking about it, and he had been talking with another broker. And what the insurance company wanted was they wanted the pilot to go to the airport and bring a flight instructor with them. And then they wanted the flight instructor to bring binoculars with a radio and watch him do takeoffs for 10 hours straight. But how can the flight instructor possibly help him in that situation? So I was thinking about it, and I went back to the insurance company and I said to them, well, why don't we find another Vans aircraft that's similar to the Vans RV3, single seat machine, and he can do some training in there. And then for the first year, we'll just increase the deductible for him. And that way he can be able to fly that aircraft. And so that's what the insurance company agreed to. So the point that I always like to say with these very examples is we can almost always make it work. We just have to come up with a good resolution to be able to make it work with the insurance company, a good story to be able to tell them, and usually we can get it signed off as long as the pilot's willing to work with the insurance company on those things. So those are the main topics that I like to talk about or that I get asked each and every day when I'm talking to pilots. And so I wanted to share some of those main things with all of you here today. So now that we've concluded those three parts, or the 3 parts that I really want to talk about, I just really wanted to emphasize the main point was that we just need to have a humble attitude. We would recommend buying a full coverage policy, a comprehensive policy. It helps protect us. It helps protect our family, the financial interests that we have in the aircraft. It just looks after everybody. And so this is what we really care about after all of these years of doing this. And now, over the last 2 years, we've been working on the Aviators Canada Insurance Program. Basically, what we did was we spent over 2,000 hours going through every aircraft insurance policy, and we compared them all together, looking at it, and then we were trying to think like a pilot as to what do we need when I'm flying an aircraft. And this is what we've been able to come up with the Aviators Canada Insurance Program. So I'm going to share my screen with you today. And we're going to look at it together to go over some of the main coverages. So let me go like this. So a normal wording for insurance policy is for all risk flight and ground. So if you crash your aircraft and it's worth $100,000, as long as you're following Transport Canada regulations, they're going to cut you a check for that aircraft. Now, what we've added on this is above and beyond what is on most policies, or it has increased limits. So number one, for the coverage for emergency medical expenses, including crew, most policies cover $10,000. But our policy covers up to $15,000. So what this means is if you have an accident and you require a quick money to be able to help out with the ambulance, hospital, etc., or for funeral services for a passenger, including a crew who sustains bodily injury or death, there's up to $15,000 each. So this is a nice increased coverage for pilots. And I love how you'll look through some policies, it doesn't include crew. It only includes passengers. We wanted to make sure that the pilot or the co-pilot of an aircraft has coverages that will be awarded to them in this policy. Now, these are fairly standard, but we have increased limits for firefighting expenses and search and rescue of $100,000. So we can possibly either send this enhancement endorsement out to everybody after so they can look at it. But these are fairly standard in policy, but we want to make sure it has the right limit, especially with the way the Canadian dollar is these days. Now, this is something that is above and beyond on our policy is with regards to the portable and handheld equipment. What this means is that the maximum right here in this line, the annual aggregate amount we will pay for all equipment is $10,000. Subject to a deductible of $250. What this means is if you have a headset, let's say it's a Bose headset, and you are flying a float plane and you crash the float plane, you have up to $10,000 for your headsets, for your iPad that has ForeFlight, all these extra things, or even if the aircraft is not in motion and it's in storage and somebody either steals it or the hangar collapses and destroys it, you also have up to $10,000 on here. So this is a very important coverage, just something little that goes above and beyond the normal wording to protect a pilot. Now, with regards to passenger coverage, we've included $10,000, as it mentions here. We'll pay $10,000 per passenger, but what we try to make sure that this amount is payable in addition to the limits of liability shown on the policy data. So once again, you're flying a float plane, you lose all your baggage in the flight, there's $10,000 worth of coverage. Now, hangars and contents coverage in coverage section 6. This is a unique coverage because number of policies in Canada, if you buy $1 million worth of liability, throughout the policy wording, you will see that there's a wording that says the $1 million, it's sub-limited down to $50,000 when it's regard to third-party hangars and contents. But we made sure that the policy limit still had $1 million if you were to burn down the 4 walls around you. So this is something that is added above and beyond on the policy wording. Now we're getting to one of the most important sections of this policy, is forced landing. And this is the one topic that I really want to talk about here. So normally if you go to Global Aerospace or you go to other companies and you do not have the Aviators Canada Insurance Program, a lot of them only offer you up to $20,000 to $30,000 or 20 to 30% of the hull value if you were to have a forced landing. So forced landing in the fact that you didn't crash the aircraft, but you landed in a place that you cannot take off again and you had to move the aircraft. So what that means is, let's say you have a Cessna 172, once again, worth $100,000. Most policies are only going to pay up to $20,000 to go get a helicopter, all these extra money to relocate your aircraft. But the nice thing under this program with our wording with Global Aerospace is it increases it here to the maximum we will pay in such circumstances is 100% of the amount of coverage A, and coverage A is the all risk flight and ground on the policy. So in the event of this situation, if you assess the 172 is worth $100,000, you would have up to the $100,000 above and beyond to be able to relocate your aircraft. Now, amendment to policy territory. Some policies, less and less, they exclude Alaska and Mexico. So the normal global aerospace wording that a lot of pilots in Canada are insured with do not have Alaska or Mexico on their policy. So we made sure to include this on the policy wording. Now, one thing I always like to make note with people is Mexico. So a lot of people see in the wording that they're included for the Caribbean, Bahamas, well en route, as well as Mexico. But if you fly to Mexico, you should be buying also a separate Spanish wording that the government requires you to have when you fly that. And if you do fly there and you don't have that, they potentially could put you in jail and take your aircraft. So the nice deal that we've worked out with Global Aerospace under the Aviators Canada Insurance Program is that upon request, they will issue their own in-house Spanish wording so that you can have that coverage while you're flying to Mexico. Now, this is normally costing around $200 to $300 US to purchase it. So if you're with any other insurance company, your broker has to go to another company that sells these specifically. But the nice thing under this wording, if you request it, it doesn't cost anything and they can issue it in-house. So it's very important to understand that if you are traveling to Mexico, obviously there's so much going on right now in Mexico, so maybe not the best idea to fly there. But if you do plan on going there, this is where this policy will extra protect you. If we go down to the next section, number 9, spares and standard wording. I haven't really seen in Canada that this is actually included on any other policy besides this one, maybe one other for maybe $10,000. But what this means is the spare parts will be covered, shall include, but not be limited to engines, propellers, components, avionics, tools, miscellaneous parts, aircraft handling and servicing equipment documents, up to, as we can see down here, $25,000. So let's say you're flying in the winter time and you've taken off your floats and you're flying around and some reason your hangar burns down and destroys the floats that are sitting there that are not attached obviously to your aircraft. Well, the nice thing is this policy automatically at no extra cost covers up to $25,000 with a $500 deductible. So it's really handy, especially if you have avionics or tools or anything that's lying around, or you maybe have your lawnmower that pulls out the aircraft. Well, as it says, it covers aircraft handling and servicing equipment as well. So it's definitely a beneficial coverage that we have included on the policy wording. Now, if we go down to trip interruption coverage, we've seen this already where an individual potentially they crashed in a place that was farther away. And so the policy pays up to $1,000 per person in addition to the amount of insurance on the aircraft shown on the policy data page. So up to a value of $5,000. So $1,000 per person, and it covers reasonable expenses for the costs of travel, food, and lodging of the pilot and passengers of the damaged aircraft. And the nice thing about this is there's no deductible on this. So they're allowed up to that full $1,000 each. So another benefit to having that trip interruption coverage. This is something very unique in this policy is the pilot clause. We call it the open pilot warranty that's included on the policy. So if you look at the policies that we insure, we name the pilots because we received their pilot information report. But then on top of that, we have added this pilot clause that says any pilot approved by you subject to minimum 150 hours total time, 10 hours on make and model and landing configuration, and 10 hours in the last or past 12 months with your permission or the aircraft's owner permission can fly the aircraft. Why is this so handy? Well, let's say you have an AME that needs to move the aircraft that has make and model time, or you have another ATPL pilot or commercial pilot that's come out for the weekend. Well, the nice thing is you don't have to send in a pilot report, wait for the insurance company to approve them, and then get a new document, even if they're just flying it once. But under this wording, with the approval of the aircraft owner, can actually just fly the aircraft and do not have to be listed as a named pilot on the policy. And in fact, they will be covered under this section, the open pilot clause or open pilot warranty. So this is something very, very unique to the policy under the Aviators Canada Insurance Program. We'll move down to premises liability extension to the aircraft. So premises liability is, for example, you invite me to go flying with you, and on the way out, I slip on something, aviation oil, whatever the case is, and I break my leg. Well, in this case, the policy will afford up to $1 million, or if you purchase higher limits, like 2 million or 3 million, it will automatically be bumped up to those limits. Or let's say your aircraft is in your hangar and you invite me into the hangar and I end up hurting myself. Well, in this case, this is where premises liability will be included on the policy. And in the past, it used to be charged for some policies, but under this one, it's no extra cost, as well as there's no extra cost to match the liability that you have purchased for flying the aircraft. So it's something definitely beneficial to have on your policy. And actually, one last thing right here. The nice thing, reason why it's nice that it automatically bumps up is, let's say you're renting a hangar from somebody, or you're renting at an airport and the city requires you to have, let's say, 2 million liability or 3 million liability, and you've already purchased this. Well, because you have this extension on here, it automatically includes it, so you don't get charged to bump up your premises liability to match the municipality or any other requirement from the city or from the aircraft owner when you're storing your aircraft in the hangar. So it's definitely a nice coverage to have. Now, hull and liability coverage for aircraft not owned by you. So if you have no share or do not own the aircraft, and you want to fly a similar aircraft that you already insure under this policy wording, you have up to the value that you've insured of the aircraft. So if it's a Cessna 172 worth 100 grand again, you have up to $100,000 worth of coverage to fly another 172. And or if your aircraft is worth up to 200,000, the policy right here says you have up to $200,000 to fly another aircraft. Now, a lot of policies in Canada do not have non-owned coverage, or if they do have non-owned coverage, it's usually only up to $100,000. So this is where this is just very unique that it gives up to that $200,000. If you plan on flying an aircraft that is similar to your aircraft and is in the same configuration, so if it's a tailwheel aircraft and you insure a tailwheel, or it's a float aircraft and your aircraft insured is a float, then you'll be able to attain coverage for flying that other aircraft under this non-owned section for the same amount of passenger seats that you have insured or less. So if you have a 172 and you want to fly a 150, this will work as well in this situation. Now, my one thing that I always say is if you're going to fly into the non-owned section for somebody else's aircraft, I still also, for coverages, recommend being named on their policy so that you're afforded the policy under their policy wording as well. Just something to think about. Now, for section number 14, extra expenses. So if you have a prop strike and you need to get another engine to fly or other things along these lines, then there is a section under here for extra expense coverage. And if you have time, if we're able to send this out to everyone, then you can take time to read through this section on here, as it's a little bit more complicated, but I just wanted to mention it under the policy wording. Now, the last couple items that are very unique to this policy is the sale of an aircraft. So let's say you sell your Cherokee to somebody else and they're flying it 6 months later and they crash the aircraft and they say it's because of something that you did to this aircraft and that's why I crashed it. Well, unique to this policy, you have up to $1 million to protect you. So if you get sued, the insurance company will be able to hire lawyers to try to show that it wasn't your fault. So the only thing is caveat to it is the aircraft insured under the policy is not an ultralight, advanced ultralight, amateur built, or home built, or any aircraft that falls under the owner maintenance program set out by Transport Canada. So this is something that is just added onto a policy to better protect our pilots in Canada. And last but not least, we have bonds on the policy. So if your aircraft gets taken and you need to have a bond or anything along those lines, that the policy includes up to $10,000 on there to protect you. See, the thing is, when we go through all these wordings, pilots are thinking about flying and they're not thinking about the coverage. When they buy an insurance policy, they're spending a lot of money for a piece of paper, hoping that in the event that an accident happens, that they have coverage. But do they really know what type of coverage they have? And that's why we're making the importance of having these webinars so that we can explain it to other pilots, letting them know that we got your back and that we're here to be able to look after you. And these are all the extra things that pilots would not know that they would actually want in the event of an accident. So that's why we spent those thousands of hours to work on this new Aviators Canada Insurance Program. But I always want to make the point that we're not perfect. And over the last year, we're still learning, but we're trying to make it a pilot's program. And overall, 80% plus on there, people have been very happy with it. And the other 20% have given us great advice so that we can continue to work on the program and make it better for pilots across Canada. So if you have any advice that you want to send our way for us to be able to continue to improve this program for pilots in Canada, we appreciate it. So just let us know. And remember, this is just the first year. As of 5 days ago, it's now the first year that we've gone into it. And it's doing very well. And so we want to continue as it grows to be able to make it better and better for pilots across Canada. So I really want to thank you all. I know it's late for your time, especially on the eastern side of Canada. I really appreciate you taking the time to be able to listen to this webinar and attend. And so now we're going to open up to some questions and answers that some of you may have that we can discuss in the last 18 minutes.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Caleb, for this presentation. I know a few questions came in on the chat window here on Microsoft Teams. We do have one question submitted on the Q&A, and we have a question submitted on YouTube Live. So if you have more questions, you can continue on submitting them to the chat function, and I'll go ahead and start with one of the first questions that we had, Caleb. A question from a viewer of the webinar here on YouTube is asking about flying basic ultralight. So he's saying that the only type of coverage or the only coverage that they would get is liability. That's the only thing available for basic ultralights. Could you touch on this topic during the Q&A period?
Yes, so at this point, obviously we can do liability only for it, but we are starting to, and I've actually already done one where we provided physical damage for the basic ultralight. So I don't see it being an issue with the insurance company. As long as the biggest issue is people for the basic ultralight will go to one broker and ask for a quote from Global Aerospace, and then they come to us where we have the Aviators Canada program with Global Aerospace, and if it's already approached, then we can't go and get a quote for it. But if it's fresh coming to us, we should be able to get Hulk coverage for the basic ultralight, depending on the value. If it's only like $2,000, maybe not. But if it's like $10,000 to $20,000, yes, it's something that we can do.
Perfect. And while we're on the topic of different types of aircraft, I know on the Covalen website for their aviation insurance program for ACIP, you do touch a little bit on different types of aircraft that are covered under the program. If you can tell us a little bit more, are there any special considerations for home builds, for drones, for we talked about basic ultralights in general?
Yeah, so what we really want to do with this program is make it for all aircraft and all pilots. So we can do home built, we can do owner maintenance, basic ultralight, advanced ultralight. All of this is not an issue for us. And right now, because insurance, it goes up and down in every 7 to 11 years for the insurance market, whether it's softer and the rates are lower or the rates are higher in a hard market. Right now, the rates are very competitive, and we haven't had any issues quoting any of these type of aircraft. So not an issue. And just a quick note on there, when we talk about all pilots, like I mentioned, like whether it's a young pilot or it's a more mature pilot, the biggest thing that we wanted to work on this program is that if you're able to get a valid medical, you're able to get insurance for your aircraft.
Amazing. Perfect. So the next question we have from Phil. Phil is asking, you mentioned that at a point where you were talking about coverage that the payment is basically predicated on following Transport Canada regulations. So if you can expand a little bit on that topic. So if somebody made a bad landing, or if they conducted a maneuver against the regulations, does that impact their coverage?
So there's two parts to that. So if they have a bad landing, they're still following Transport Canada regulations, and insurance is made for somebody that's negligent. So what that means is if they're negligent, they're the reason why they caused the accident. But as long as they're following Transport Canada regulations, flying the aircraft in the weight category it's supposed to be flown, all these things, and then of course the policy is afforded under the insurance on there, so no issue. But if you're doing a maneuver like a barrel roll and an aircraft is not an aerobatic aircraft and you crash the aircraft, then you're not following the regulations. So in that case, obviously we had to leave it up to an adjuster, but in that case, there most likely would not be coverage under the policy wording.
Perfect. I'll go ahead and continue through some of the other questions that are coming in. Someone is asking, Peter is asking, my aircraft is stored in my hangar which I own. Do I need to get additional hangar insurance covering the building, or is it covered within the policy?
Yes, so it's a great question. So we would always recommend the physical damage to the hangar itself is not covered in the policy. So we always recommend that an individual goes and buys a hangar policy, which obviously we can issue. And then we always like it when they have the premises liability in the policy, but we always recommend that an individual, but a lot of people don't want to buy it because of the cost, to have a standalone aviation general liability for their hangar. What that means is if you have your aircraft under this policy and the aircraft is stored in the hangar and somebody slips and falls and breaks their leg, yes, there's coverage under the policy. But let's say their aircraft is in Florida and their hangar is in Ontario, and then all of a sudden snow is on the roof and it falls off and damages a car. That has nothing to do with the operation of the aircraft itself. It has to do with the operation of the hangar. So that's why we recommend that they buy a property policy as well as a premises liability policy that is associated with the operation of the hangar. Fortunately, like years ago, they were like $1,200, $1,500, but they've been coming down to like $600, $700 for the liability policies. So it's getting a lot more affordable for people.
I guess the follow-up to that question, they were asking, let's say the hangar burdens down, is there money to rebuild back the original premise or the building? And you're saying that this would be a separate policy for the building? Property
policy that they would want to purchase through another market that specializes in hangars, which of course we do hundreds and hundreds of hangars across Canada.
And can you bind property policies under the ACIP program?
It's associated where they do receive special coverages with it, and we're working on streamlining aviation or hangar insurance so that it can be done a lot faster than it used to be. So it's something that's definitely going to really help out pilots across Canada.
Amazing. All right. Mark is asking if you've missed any part of today's webinar. The presentation is recorded. We are live streaming on YouTube. The stream will be available recorded. You can watch it later on. And Rick is asking if we can put up your contact information. We'll probably do that towards the end of today's webinar. A few more questions. Manfred is asking, my flying has been interrupted by a medical issue. Does that create a problem to get insured?
So, and I like this question because I want to reiterate, for flying the aircraft, if you have a valid medical, we can get you coverage. But if you do lose your medical, you still have not in motion coverage for storage on the aircraft. So it doesn't actually affect the aircraft insurance itself. It's only, once again, if you want to fly it, you need to, of course, have a valid medical on there.
All right, and at some point you had mentioned the importance of check rides, and we talked about a qualified instructor. So John is asking, what is the definition of a qualified instructor? Basically, does it mean any currently licensed Canadian flight instructor, or is it one that's also current on the type of the aircraft?
Yeah, so it's a great, this is one question I get all the time. So there is no definition to qualified flight instructor. So they should have something that's on similar make and model. The reason why they started to bring out the word qualified was years ago, there was a flight instructor that had just finished, and he went up with a guy in a jet. and was trying to train them on it, and they crashed it. So that's why they ended putting the word qualified. So they don't necessarily have to have make and model time, which I still recommend they try and find some. If a guy's just been flying a 172 and he's trying to go to a Cirrus to train somebody, but it's not, there's no, at this time that I know of, a definition for it, but it should have at least similar make and model and be reading the POH of the aircraft and all those things, etc.
Perfect. A few other questions that came from our members prior to the webinar. So we asked people to submit some of the questions that they had. And one interesting question that came across is about fractional ownership. So if I own a share in an aircraft and I want to get insurance through the ACIP program, but maybe the rest of the shares, the rest of the ownership of the aircraft is not insured with you or with the program, how does that work?
Yeah, so you always want to do just one policy. So there's not like separate policies, because if you have one policy here and one policy here in the event of a loss, insurance company is going to fight who pays out for it. So it should always be just one policy. And for many years, I flew a Cessna 150 that was under a fractional ownership. And I personally highly recommend it. It helps people get into aviation at an affordable cost. We were flying a cheap 150 and it definitely made it affordable for maintenance, insurance, and all that stuff. Now, with regards to fractional ownership, not an issue for us to insure. Most people have 3 or 4 pilots on there that all have a share in there. But the biggest thing that I always recommend is, if you're going into a fractional ownership, is make sure you, first of all, know the people that are doing it and their personalities, as well as have something in writing. Once again, bringing up that point of, in the event of an accident, who's going to pay for the deductible, who's going to pay for the rate increase. If there's a student pilot on there compared to everybody else, well, give us a call and ask us what the difference in price is for that person. They're usually okay to pay that little extra money because they don't have to go to a flight school to go do their training. So there's a lot of little nuances that we can help just by giving indications to help people understand their fractional ownership better when insuring their aircraft.
Perfect. We do have another question from Randy's asking, Randy says they fly regularly in the summer, but not for a few months in the winter. How do they need to get a check ride each spring?
So the insurance companies, they always look at it this way, that as long as you fly, depending on the aircraft, as long as you fly more than 10 hours a year, they usually don't give you a check ride on there. Now, in saying that, during the winter, the most accidents that we have is usually the May long weekend, because everyone's a little bit rusty. They haven't flown. They bring out their aircraft, super excited to fly. And then that's usually when we get the most calls. So we always recommend doing a check ride throughout there, but the insurance company is not necessarily going to require you to do a check out if you've been flying more than 10 to 20 hours a year on your aircraft.
Perfect. Amazing. Another question that came from the COPA membership prior to tonight's webinar is, for any flying clubs that own and operate an aircraft, if they do any flight training on that aircraft for any commercial operation, can you tell us a little bit about what they can get in terms of insurance coverage under ACIP?
So there's 2 parts to that question. So there's 2 types of flying club. One flying club acts like a flight school and is an FTU. Or there's a flying club that people buy into it, whether they're a student pilot or they're a private pilot license and they want to fly it. So under the one where it's just a normal flying club and they have a flight instructor on staff, or not staff, but flight instructor that checks everybody out, this would qualify under the Aviators Canada Insurance Program. And under these policy wordings, normally a flying club would have bylaws that they discuss on how often they should do their training on there. And then with regards to the insurance policy, we would just determine how many people are flying the aircraft for the year. Is it 10 people? Is it 20? And at that point, that's what the insurance company is going to base the price off of there, because they're going to be listing it as what we call a straight open pilot warranty. So if the club approves them by their bylaws, they automatically are good to fly the aircraft. It doesn't have to be an hour requirement or anything like that. Now, on the other side, if you are an FTU, we insure 20, 30, 40 flight schools across the country. So we can easily handle that and give you all the frills and everything that you need with the commercial side of it. Not an issue there.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you very much, Caleb, for your time. We do have one more question coming in from Grant. Grant is asking, when do you recommend getting renter's insurance?
Yeah, so we get a lot of requests on renter's insurance. And obviously we offer non-owned aircraft insurance policies to individuals. Now, I do recommend it in the case that it's a secondary policy as well as their deductible coverage on there, where it will cover up to $5,000 of the deductible. And they're relatively cheap policies. Now, a lot of people, they want to buy aircraft non-owned so they can fly a whole bunch of aircraft on there. But what they need to understand is a non-owned aircraft insurance policy is actually a secondary policy. So the main policy for flying is the aircraft policy that is for that aircraft. So if you're just flying, let's say this one, the aircraft policy does not have insurance and a person's flying non-owned on that one right there. Now, if they go and crash that aircraft and they purchase that policy, then they have coverage because they are negligent. But now let's say this person's not maintaining their aircraft and it just crashes. This pilot is not negligent, so this policy does not activate. So that's why it's always important, if you want to buy a non-owned, it is nice to have the extra coverage, but I always recommend, and I don't do this when I fly, that they have full all-risk flight and ground coverage, and then I'm either covered under the open pilot warranty or I'm named as an approved pilot on there. But we do have non-owned up to it's $250,000 on the haul, down to $10,000 just to cover deductible, and as well as the liability side of it too. So no issue, but I always just recommend getting named as an approved pilot on the policy.
Amazing, thank you. We do have a couple of other questions that might be specific to the people that are asking them. We have Rick is asking if you do any hangar policy in PEI. Ed's also asking if they're currently insured with a different broker with Global Aerospace as the underwriter, can they get a quote from you? So for those and any other questions that people might have, how can people get in touch, Caleb?
Yeah, so they can email the COPA at Covalen.ca. So Covalen is COVALEN.ca, and then we'll be able to reach out to them directly. So I just want to quickly say, because I know we only have 3 minutes left, for those ones that are already with Global Aerospace, unfortunately, we cannot get a quote for them with Global Aerospace. We can go to other markets with it, but we can't because it's already the same market. So that's why we have what we call an appointment letter. So if they want to switch over and get all those extra coverages at the same price or less, then they can do that. But at the same time, the Aviators Canada Insurance Program, the main market is Global Aerospace. But we've been doing this for a long time, so we have many other markets that we're able to place your insurance and also do quotes for you.
Amazing, perfect. So I'll go ahead and recap by quickly thanking you, Caleb, for this very insightful presentation today, and thank you everyone for all of those who have joined us today. So COPA had a very rich lineup of webinars for this winter. We will continue on doing those webinars. We might have one more. We do have a webinar hosted in partnership with NAV Canada. NAV is going to be presenting their new portal, basically. So sorry, the name escapes me. Metcam and their new NOTAM platform, basically, that they're using. They will be hosting 2 webinars on May 7th, one during the day and one in the afternoon. You can find information about the how to register for those webinars on the COPA website and on the COPA flight deck. And we encourage you to keep an eye in your inbox for any upcoming COPA events, virtual and in-person. Flying season is upon us, so there will be a lot of in-person events happening at COPA flights all across Canada. So with that being said, I just want to thank Caleb again for your time, and wish everyone here a good night.
Thank you very much. And if you don't mind me saying one last thing, Hannah, if anybody wants us to do any of these webinars for their individual chapters, just reach out to me and I'm more than willing to help out.
Yeah, any chapters, any local COPA flights that are looking to have an aviation insurance presentation similar to the one that was done here, you can reach out to Caleb, you can reach out to the COPA office, and we would be more than happy to coordinate that. All right.
Thank you,
Thank
Hannah.
you, everyone. Have a good night.